Culture is the shared, personal, and learned life experience of a group of individuals who have a common set of values, norms, and traditions. It's learned, both consciously and unconsciously, through the communication of symbols for meaning. An aspect of culture are values, which are the standards and ideals most emphasized in a culture. In your culture, in your household, your family might emphasize doing well in school, whereas in other cultures, it might be less emphasized. In yours, it might be to pay respect to your elders. In others, it might be less emphasized. Norms inside a culture are patterns of communication. It might be normal for an Italian to use their hands when they speak. That's at least a stereotypical norm that people assign to Italian households. And traditions are customs of a culture. You might also associate Italian households with Catholicism and attending Mass on Sundays and certain types of foods in an Italian family's Christmas and the like. Intercultural communication refers to communication across national cultures. For an example, an American might have intercultural communication with someone he meets in the Philippines, whereas cross-cultural communication would refer to communication between groups within one national culture. In the United States, someone born here might have Filipino descent, but they are in fact Asian American. So that would be cross-cultural communication within the United States. If you're, say, a Black man speaking with an Asian American, that would be an African American speaking with an Asian American, that would be cross-cultural. And Edward Hall examined culture in a deep way and identified that we learn how, where, why, when, and to whom through cultural teachings. And when we communicate, we reinforce our cultural practices. So we have learned patterns and behaviors that are specific to the cultures that we exist in. Culture at its core creates community, which is a common understanding of people who are committed to coexist. So we have co-cultures within our communities, which are like cultures inside of cultures. For example, in a classroom, we might have 2 or 3 Catholics who understand religion through the lens of Catholicism, and we might have some Jewish students who understand religion through the lens of Judaism, and we might have some Muslims in the class, and all of those people in the class, while having different religious backgrounds, are still in the larger culture of Delaware County Community College. So one of their co-cultures might be their religious culture that they share with some other classmates, but the larger community might be that they have other traits that they share with, they have other traits that they share as a member, as a resident of Delaware County. Like they know what a hoagie is, and they know what a cheesesteak is, as opposed to a sub or steak and cheese. So each community has individual and unique behaviors and practices, but also subscribes to behaviors and practices shared by a larger national culture. So in Delaware County, we have specific language. Out in Philadelphia area, you might hear people say "use guys," which is kind of unique to Philadelphians and maybe New Yorkers, where you would not hear that sort of language in other places in the United States. In the South, you might hear y'all instead of use guys from your friend group. So while we have and share similarities with other Americans, like an American flag that represents us, we might know what community or culture in the United States in terms of region somebody comes from by listening to the words that they use. Even though they're American, I can understand the community more specifically where they come from is probably a Philadelphia or New York type place because of the way that they speak. A culture clash is a conflict over cultural expectations. You might experience this when you are meeting your boyfriend or girlfriend's family for the first time. You don't know whether you should say grace at the table, whether you should hold hands, whether you should pray before a meal. If they do some sort of prayer, you might not know the prayer and you kind of fumble with your words. You're not sure when you enter, should you take your shoes off at the door? Should you not take your shoes off at the door? Should you refer to them as sir and ma'am, or will they say you make us feel old? Just call us by our first names, right? So we experience a culture clash when we are in an environment that is different from what our household or our culture would expect. Cultural commonalities like language, values, norms, and traditions bind us on a national level. We share the national anthem. We share the stars and stripes. We share educational standards, which are nationalized, and we have a shared history. And that's sort of, those commonalities bind us as Americans. If you were to go abroad, you might look for or respond to a random American person, if you're an American, that you run into in some other country. And you might find comfort having that shared value. The same thing, of course, occurs if you are an international student in the United States and you run into a fellow Nigerian, for example. You might find comfort in running in and meeting that person because you have some sort of shared background and experience. Culture is multi-leveled, and aspects of identity related to age, sexual identity, gender, race, and religion, among other things, can also bind us. So you might, if your family goes to a picnic and there's a lot of other families there, based on age, it might be likely that your daughter, who is 5, becomes friends with the other a little boy who is also 5, because they and you want to, then they play together because they're of the same age. People that have these kinds of similar characteristics or traits or identities sometimes will group together. An aspect of culture that is often examined is how specific cultures and communities use power and share power amongst the group. Uncertainty avoidance refers to how tolerant or intolerant a particular culture or individual is of uncertainty. If you are high in uncertainty avoidance, you are more rigid. So if you are high in uncertainty avoidance, you're more conservative, generally speaking. Intercultural communication problems surface when a person raised in a culture that tolerates ambiguity encounters another who has little tolerance. In my household, for example, my mother may have encouraged dialogue and discussing at the dinner table why we made certain decisions in our lives, whereas my spouse maybe lived in a house where her father was the end all be all, and would say, do as I say, simply because he had the power in the household or in that particular culture. In some cultures, there are patriarchal tendencies where the father may be the decision maker of the household. In some households in the United States, currently, it may be matriarchal. It could be that the mother is making the final decision, particularly in single parent households, and others. So power distance describes how culture deals with power. If they are high in power distance, they often revere high status, while if they are lower in power distance, they would distribute power regardless of gender, age, or status. So power distance in Japanese culture is quite high. The older senior members of a family or a organization like a business are often revered, and you would be out of place if you would question their thought process or decisions. Whereas in contemporary, let's say, venture capital firms in the United States, those are often pride themselves in having or argue that they have low power distance. They want the best ideas to rise to the top, and they don't care whose idea it is necessarily, so long as it makes them the most money and it's the most well-informed decision, right? So Ray Dalio, who is a venture capitalist, has some ideas on that I'll link in our I'll link online. Masculine cultures are said to focus on achievement, competitiveness, strength, and material success, while feminine cultures are said to emphasize equality, nurturance, quality of life, supportiveness, and affection. Some would say that these are just individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. Individualistic being masculine, collectivistic being feminine. But historically, we have assigned these genders concepts to these ideas, and you can certainly take issue with those assignings. As I mentioned, individualistic, achievement-based societies are often called masculine, and individualism, the United States is often perceived as the most individualistic, capitalistic type environment, if not the most, one of the most, where the ideal is that the individual is given enough freedoms to pick himself or herself up from their own bootstraps. And a collectivistic society would have been communist Russia in the 1970s, where the goods and services are shared equally from the janitor at the plant to the CEO. Of course, contemporary business cultures and workplaces are a bit of a mix. We do have in corporate America a lot of distrust of executive suites in the United States currently because of the ratio of wealth that they make compared to the lowest members. But there are some more collectivistic corporations. They're called co-ops. Often there's a big one in Spain, and often those require that the highest person in the company, like the CEO, and the lowest person can only have a diversity of wage or income by 8x, whereas in the United States it can be 50, right? So if in these co-ops in Spain, where let's say the janitor makes 50,000, the CEO can only make 400,000 a year because it's 8x. That way the organization is incentivized to raise the lowest wage when they're raising the highest wage. So culturally in the United States, we have a huge argument constantly about communism, socialism, and capitalism. And really most cultures are a mixture of these things, a mixture of individualistic and collectivistic ideas. There are differences between high context cultures and low context cultures. In high context cultures, we can't take anything said necessarily at face value because hierarchies might be at play, facial expressions and friendships can affect the meaning. For example, if in high context cultures, if somebody is guilty, but they are friends with the mayor, it is quite possible that they get away with the crime. Whereas in low context cultures, there aren't all these hierarchies, and a criminal can be convicted regardless of who they are. Amongst intercultural communication, the technological imperative suggests that technological advancement increases opportunities for intercultural communication. So it suggests that advancing technology is a good thing because it facilitates intercultural communication. We can learn about other cultures from across the planet, and it might open our eyes to some flaws in our own culture or some ways to adapt or some good things about our own culture. And the demographic imperative suggests that some co-cultures reject that blending into a national culture is ideal. So we have a contemporary argument about assimilation of students. So there's a lot of people who believe that Spanish-speaking immigrants to the United States should be assimilated quickly into speaking English language in, let's say, second and third grade, and really nothing else is important in terms of comprehension, like learning math or science. They just need to learn English. And others would say we should be teaching in their native language or their easiest language to learn, because math and science are important. They'll eventually learn the English, but we should supplement with Spanish language speaking. The economic imperative suggests that due to the global village and outsourcing, few societies are isolated from one another, and there is an economic imperative to become culturally aware. So it benefits, the argument is that it benefits you to not be so rigid in your interpretations or experiences culturally, to be more open-minded, because there's an economic imperative. You can make more money if you're more open to other cultures. And that can be exemplified easily from let's imagine you're a small business owner. Do you only want to serve one particular group in the United States, or do you want to have everyone as your potential customers? And so that would be the economic imperative to embrace intercultural communication. The peace imperative suggests that gaining diverse perspectives is critical to safety, so that the more we understand other cultures, the more safe we are. We can defend maybe against their most aggressive tendencies, or at least be conscious or aware of them, or we can make sure we're not too passive or laid back as a culture when the world is potentially a dangerous place, as we see globally today. Self-awareness imperative suggests that identifying your own worldview and cultural with your cultural identity is beneficial. So if we know that, for example, the United States tends to be a warring country, we can vote according to this knowledge that maybe we should not be involved so much in foreign wars, or we should take a more passive approach. So it is imperative that we understand maybe the history of the country, that our own worldview is that the United States is the greatest place on earth, but maybe we shouldn't force democracy on other burgeoning nations. And maybe it's not something that we can implant. Our own ideologies should not be implanted in other parts of the world. So there is this argument in government often, whether we should be trying to get involved in other governments and other parts of the world, or we should just worry about our own culture, our own country. The ethical imperative suggests that we decide what is right and wrong in comparison to the behaviors and ethics of others. So we might look at the war in, let's say we might look at the war in Ukraine and say, wow, Russia was the aggressor there. They entered the country and almost 1 million people are dead. And if that was wrong, how can we justify that Israel is invading Palestine? So we might understand ethics based on, if we think this is unethical, if the first example is unethical, how can the second example, which is very similar, be ethical? So in the same way, Russian media and bots and trolls often promote online that if Russia, for example, moved into and started working very closely with the government of Mexico, wouldn't the United States have a major issue with that? And would they then attack Mexico? So the ethical imperative asks us to look at, if the reverse were true, if it were happening to us, what would our position be? And I'm not saying any of these positions are correct or incorrect, but there are logical arguments on both sides. The challenges of culture, of intercultural communication, is that we are ethnocentric, which is when we judge another culture by the standards of our own, or believe in our own superiority. The example of the school and language situation might be a good example of ethnocentrism, where people would argue that English is better than Spanish. And I don't know that that's inherently true. It's more global and more important to know English in settings such as law and business, arguably. So you could make I would suggest the economic argument that English is more important to learn. But it's still ethnocentric because the language itself, English, is not any better or any worse than Spanish or some other Romance language. Stereotyping is another challenge of intercultural communication, which are generalizations about groups and unwillingness to investigate individual identity. So I traveled in Colombia, and I experienced some distaste for being American. And on multiple occasions, I had people kind of dislike me for being American. And even though I didn't necessarily adhere to the or wasn't even conscious of Reagan or some of the Bush politics that may have affected Colombia, I was kind of lumped into certain individuals dislike me because of my Americanism. Now, when you travel in other places, you might have a positive bias towards you. I receive a positive bias when I'm in the Philippines or in Peru. People are generally think positively of Americans in those places. But there are some places where being American is bad, and you're stereotyped as somebody who messed with their politics, maybe lumped in with the CIA or as a colonizer if you're or what have you. So there are other challenges such as anxiety towards outgroups. In the United States, there are some anxieties about the immigrants on the southern border. You can hear it culturally on television every day. And there are anxieties for friends of mine who are Russian, who are entering parts of Europe because Putin often uses Russian diaspora to say that these groups of people are being targeted once they're there, and then he uses that as a reason to invade, saying that the ethnic minority Russians are being targeted and treated poorly, which of course in most cases is not true. It's just a reason to go to war or to take over that territory. So there are reasons to have anxiety for outgroups. There are psychological reasons that you might be scared subconsciously of someone who doesn't look like you or doesn't speak your language. There are logical reasons for that. But there are also logical reasons that some people in societies like outside influence. So there are biological reasons. So to improve your intercultural understanding, you should know your biases and stereotypes, tolerate the unknown, practice cultural respect and empathy, practice cultural relativity, or refrain from condemning any practice in which another culture engages, reevaluate and eliminate your prejudices, educate yourself, prepare for consequences, and relate to the individual as opposed to stereotyping or generalizing the group.